Well, I'm extremely excited to have you with me on this edition of our Daily Dose. The reason behind that is today marks our 100th episode of this program, and I've been so excited and so proud and looking forward to this day for quite some time. Now, if you're like I am, you realize that because we've only had 100 episodes, this program must not be so daily. My heart transplant, for example, took place some 258 days ago, and this program began about 20 or some odd days before that. But I'm going to tell you, friends, as you well would understand, while I was in the hospital especially, I didn't have a whole lot of opportunities to do the program regularly. And that's because I just simply have days where I couldn't get to it, days when the staff was in and out too much, or I just didn't feel well, such as that. And the same has really been the case since transplant. Although I woke up a brand new man, I woke up feeling great in comparison to what I'd ever felt before in my life. At the same time, you still have ups and downs. The healing process has not been easy. It's not been the worst, but it's not been easy. And so from time to time, I missed episodes because I just simply didn't feel like doing one. But at the very same time, my spirits have always been high, I hope, and my willingness to want to share some encouraging words with you has always been there, and I pray always will be. And so I'm so glad to have the opportunities that I have. Now, in addition to that, I've been very busy going about preaching and teaching here and there and all over in different congregations around the southeastern United States, getting to rejoin with many friends, getting to meet many others, and that's part of the blessing of God that I've been given, this opportunity to be renewed as a gospel preacher, to go out and preach the gospel. I've been involved in several meetings already since transplant. There are many, many more scheduled for this next year, as well as one-day events and such. So I'm going to be a very busy man, and that's simply by the grace and the blessing and the providence of God. I'm so thankful for it. Now, I mentioned on Facebook and maybe on Twitter on yesterday that when we reached our 100th episode, which is this one, that I begin to tell you something about my transplant story. Now, the majority of you that have found this program over time may have gone back and reviewed some of the previous episodes, and so you have some understanding as to what took place from around May the 2nd when I was condemned to the hospital at UAB of last year, and maybe where I've come to today. But you may not have any idea how I got to the hospital to begin with. That is, what was my heart transplant journey really like? And so it's very simple. However, this will be divided into several programs over the next few days. Otherwise, it'd be rather lengthy, and you might not enjoy listening or watching it very much. But if you want to think back to a time, which was my date of birth, March the 12th, 1975, I was born the second oldest son to my mother and father, John and Sharon Merle. Of course, my sister will be 2 years younger than me, and she had not been born yet, obviously. But however, she would be born exactly on my birthday 2 years later. But nonetheless, I was born March the 12th, 1975. At that point in time, I suppose the doctors noticed a little something wrong, but they really had no idea as to what could be the problem with me as that infant. It was inside of about a week, however, they discovered I had a condition known as transposition of the great vessels, or the great arteries. And basically what that meant was that my heart was operating totally backwards. It's like, and when it grew together, it was all hooked up wrong. And to describe it easily, basically you have two pumps in your heart that matter. There's the left side and the right side. 4 chambers, but 2 sides. And the one side of that, the larger side, is supposed to supply blood to your entire body, hence rejuvenating your muscles and such as that, keeping things fresh and what they need to be. But at the same time, the smaller side of your heart is supposed to only circulate the blood back through the lungs to pick up oxygen to go out to the left side or other side of your heart and supply the entire body. And what was happening in me was basically the opposite of that. My larger chamber was operating with my lungs, where my smaller chamber was trying to operate my entire body, which is basically physically impossible. And so when I was born with that, discovered about a week or so, my parents began to panic. Now, not because of what they knew at that time, but because of what the doctors were saying. I have several letters that took place. And of course, this is 1975, so emails and text and such as that, fax machines were not even available that I know of. And so these letters were written by hand, most of them, sent by snail mail between my doctor in Anniston, Alabama, and my pediatric cardiologist, Dr. Bargeron, in Birmingham, Alabama. And basically, I've read those letters. And they are very disturbing, not only to me in hindsight, knowing this little baby being discussed was me, but they would be disturbing to any parent or any person probably. But they basically give a pattern of my quick digression and how I was falling fast. I was called a blue baby at that point. And basically what would happen is any time I was sitting, being held, or for that matter, at any time, any moment, I could stop breathing and quit breathing, and eventually my heart could stop. And so because of that, my parents went through tremendous struggles even that early on, because no one wanted to be holding Jim when he passed away. And that's what they assumed just very well might happen. It very well could have, including my grandparents. One of my grandmothers, I'm told, was even afraid herself. She just didn't want to spend a lot of time holding me. Now, she loved me and she cared for me, and she would sometimes hold and snuggle, but she didn't want to be the main one. She didn't want to be there alone. And so because of that, with that lack of support by others, not to their discredit, I'm not to putting them down in that, but because of the lack of support there, it pretty much left things up to my mother and father. And with my father having to work, it pretty much left things to my mother. And so it made it really, really hard. She's dealing with a 6-year-old brother, my brother Jerry, and at the same time caring for me as a newborn who could turn blue and perhaps even die in any moment. And so we only had 2 neighbors that I know about that lived up the street, one of which has passed away, the other still living, however, who would come down often. And they would come down and tell my mother, we're not afraid. You go out and go for a walk. You go to the grocery store. You do the things that you need to do, and we'll keep Jim and he'll be just fine. And I'm certain that she didn't go out with a lot of confidence, or that she went out in that point and said, oh, well, they've got him, I'm not worried. I know that she did. But over time, she began to take advantage of their help. And over time, it really became a tremendous help to her. And so although she had felt alone for probably weeks or months, now she had a bit of help, but it was still not the same. As those letters continue to be passed back and forth, I've read one that basically says this child's not going to make it. His weight is not what it ought to be. I'd only gained a pound or so in about the first 6 months after birth, and he's not growing like he should. These things continue to happen. The condition continues to worsen. And so I know they were, for lack of better terms, scared to death. But as the way it turned out, I was being taken to Birmingham, Alabama. I was seeing a doctor known as Dr. Bargeron, which I'll mention a little bit later. And he had decided that some sort of surgery needed to be done. Some sort of corrective surgery needed to be done. And as a matter of fact, he advised him as to what that would be. That would be known as the mustard procedure. Now, it was a procedure that was in use a bit at that point in time, but had not been used necessarily on children. As a matter of fact, they told them that they would refuse to open me up to do any kind of surgery on me until I weighed a certain weight and or was at least a year old. But you see, at that 6 months point, I had not grown very much. And at that 6 month point, I was pretty much at death's door, as we say. And so finally they came back and they said, we'll do the surgery, but we do not give you hardly any chance at all that he'll survive. Now, obviously, without the surgery, I wouldn't survive. That was just the known. They understood that, my parents and the doctors and everyone around them. But even with the surgery, there was maybe about a 10% or so chance that I could go inside of those operating room doors and come out alive. But my parents, I know it had to have been through their faith in God and their extreme courage and strength, I suppose, and through their love for me especially, they made the choice to allow that surgery to take place. So at 6 months, on September the 30th, 1975, I was taken into surgery. The surgery was performed. It was a rather lengthy surgery, and it was very successful. The mustard procedure was done, which basically, through a series of baffles and rerouting and patching of some holes in my heart and such, rerouted the blood just enough to allow me to survive. But it wasn't but a few hours there after surgery I had to be taken back. The bleeding was severe, and they had to open me back up and go back in. So you can imagine all the terrifying emotions that came back into their lives. But after that point, I was doing pretty well. Before very long, I made my way to the home, and of course was back home with my brother and my parents, and beginning to grow and develop, and really made tremendous improvement very quickly. If I had the photos to show you, and I hope I can obtain them, maybe come back and add them to the video, the photos between me maybe a few days before surgery and a few days after surgery were just amazing. And so you could really see a change in me immediately. But they weren't out of the woods. The doctors had told them at that point that even with the surgery, it wouldn't be very likely that I'd make it out of childhood. They didn't expect me to live on to my teenage years or anything such as that. They expected several more surgeries and a lot of medication, and on it would go at that point in time because this surgery was so rare. As a matter of fact, one of the things I missed in my surgery that's going to be important later as I tell my story is that the main doctor that had agreed to do it initially was a man by the name of Dr. Kirkland. Now, you think of the Kirkland Clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. This was that Dr. Kirkland's father, if I understand it. Dr. Kirkland was at that point already beginning to gain some, if you will, clout, to gain some respect among the medical world as far as doing open heart surgeries on young children. But nevertheless, at the last moment, he backed out. He didn't feel like his hands were nimble enough to perform the surgery, so yet another surgeon came up, a little younger than him, by the name of Dr. Pacifico, and that name's worth remembering for later also. Dr. Pacifico was younger, and as they said of him now, looking back, they said, he wasn't afraid to cut someone's head off and sew it back on just because he thought he could. And it took his kind of, if you will, his type of guts, for lack of better terms, his type of skill is what it turns out to be, to perform the surgery. And so that's why things were successful. Of course, God's hand was in it all the while. But I did have the best doctors and the best surgeons available, provided by God at that point. But nonetheless, moving back forward, I went on from the age of 6 months, and I continued to grow and continue to develop. Of course, I was always a small child as far as being very skinny, skinny as a rail, as we say. But nonetheless, as the years grew on, I went to the doctor sometimes every 3 months, every 6, every year, and then finally up into every 3 years. Now, every doctor visit that I would go to, whether it be the 6 months out or the 3 year out, and they got spaced out that way. 3 years was the most I ever was able to go without going to the doctor for a checkup. But every time I would go, Dr. Bargeron by that point had become world renowned in some senses. And as I would go to that teaching hospital, UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham, they would not often do my echoes and EKGs and such as that. They wouldn't often do them in the regular rooms. They would typically move all the machinery over to larger halls or such as that, or at least conference rooms, because the room would be packed with doctors. And they were seeing such success in that time and by me and what I was able to do because of their surgery and such, that they were blown away by it. And so there often would be 25, 30, 40 doctors sometimes standing around the room, all just listening with every ounce of ability they had and watching as closely as they could to find out and learn more about this wonderful procedure that had been done that had saved this baby's life. And so I was somewhat of a poster child for UAB Hospital, I suppose, for many, many years. Now, from that point on, as I began to go farther and farther between those things, and they had always advised my parents, don't let him run around a lot. Don't let him do this. Keep him out of that. Keep him out of this. But I began to sneak around. I suppose I was about 8, 9, 10 years old. And I began to sneak around, and I would run and play with the other kids, and I would do the things the other kids did. And finally, I had secretly got myself in as much better shape than the doctors ever expected. So much so that when I would go in, they would actually be shocked by that point in time as to how well I was doing. Now that continued on, and I didn't play organized sports necessarily. I never played football, but I was a trainer on the football team, and I ran wind sprints with those guys. I did everything that they did. I became a part of the team. I was a team captain several weeks just because I thought I gave a lot to it. And I really learned a lot during those days. I learned how to take care of myself. I learned how to do on my own, and I learned how to strengthen my body without harming myself, and it really helped me. As a matter of fact, it happened to fall that on my 18th birthday, my doctor, Dr. Pacifico, that we had not heard from, he was the surgeon in that occasion back when I was 6 months old, who we had not heard from since the day after surgery, called my mother, just happenstance on my 18th birthday, and very awkwardly asked a question, and that was, is he alive? Is he still alive? I was thinking of him today, or ran across his chart, and I want to know if he's still alive. And friends, as you well know, I was. My mother could, with a great smile on her face, said, yes, he's alive. He's graduated high school. He's working in a cabinet company. He's doing this. He's doing that. And she told him all about what was going on with me. And he was so proud to hear it. She was so proud to tell him. And I was so excited to get home to know that we'd even heard from this man. And to be reminded once again that they never expected me to make it out of childhood. They would have never imagined I would have made it anywhere near teens or even into adulthood. But it would be up until I was about 32 years old or so, and we'll carry on with this in another program, that I would absolutely do fine. I would never take a pill. I would never need another surgery. No corrections were ever to be made. I would do just fine. But the doctors predicted what would come, and as we'll discuss on tomorrow, those things did come. The rhythm problems, the weakening muscle, the heart failure, all of that came, and it came just as they predicted, but a much later age than they ever supposed. You see, I'm telling this not only to share with you my story and to help those who may be facing transplant, or help those with children who are hurting. And by the way, as I would go to clinic every year as an adult, once you're a congenital patient, you're always a congenital patient. I would go to the doctor's office, and to be me, that big kid, 25, 30, 35 years old, sitting there with infants and newborns and such, and their parents would be rolling with tears, worried about their child. And I could come over and put my arm around them and say, I was your baby so many years ago. My parents were just like you back then also, But you are in the hands of the best men that can be provided. And if they are with God, friends, they're in the hands of God. And that's exactly what I was. As we come back on yet another day, I hope to continue to discuss things with you from basically that phone call on my 18th birthday on forward and even closer under my transplant. Friends, I've been so very blessed. And I promise you, if you'll do what God asks you to do, He will bless you too. Thank you very much. And I hope that you'll be encouraged.